here. Okay, that looks good. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahavidyan Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvisha vahai. Shanti, Shanti. That same problem. Okay, let me put this over here. That seems to work better. Okay, welcome. There you are. Welcome to all of you for assembled here for our weekly satsang, and also welcome to the many students all over the world. It's kind of fun to receive these questions from our online students. And what we'll do today, like last week, is we'll take both. We'll take some questions from the online students and some questions from our local New Jersey students here. So let us begin. This is from Narayanam. This is your question? Good. So it is from one of our local students. And Narayanan asks, Scripture says brahma satyam, jagan mithya. Actually, it's Shankaracharya's statement, not found in any scripture. And it says brahma satyam. Brahman is what is real, the underlying reality, because of which everything exists. And jagan mithya, jagat, the world, is mithya. And the question he goes on to ask is, when you say brahma satyam, jagat mithya, I thought this was non-dual Vedanta. What happens to Advaita when you have one Brahman, which happens to be satyam, and you have one world that happens to be mithya? That doesn't look non-dual. And there's a very easy answer for that question. Do I have one pot and one clay? There are two things. And this is two things? This is one thing. It's only one thing, right? It's one thing from two perspectives. From the perspective of form, we call it pot. From the perspective of essence or content, we call it clay. One thing, two perspectives. One is a fundamental perspective, this is clay. And the other is a more general perspective when we call this pot, reference to its form. One thing, two perspectives. From an absolute perspective and from a relative perspective. Absolutely speaking, there's nothing here but clay. Relatively speaking, I'm holding a pot. But there's only one thing. Do you want to follow up on that? Yeah. So let's start using this microphone.
I think my question really is the second part of that email I sent you. When it refers to jagat, you call it mithya. When it comes to jiva, you say it's the same.
Mm-hmm.
So the root of this question is my understanding of Brahman as existence. My Brahman as existence.
Sorry. I'm smiling because this new system has just all kinds of problems. Anyway, continue, please.
So, I think the root of that question is my understanding of Brahman as existence and consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
So, jagat also.
What exactly is your question?
So, jagat is existence, also existent. Jiva is also
existent, not existence.
But what is the difference between the existing of the jagat and the existence of jiva?
So what is the difference between the existence of Brahman and the existence of jagat versus existence of jiva? What is the difference between the existence of Jagat and the existence of jiva. Same.
So if that is the case, the saying was that Jagat is mithya, whereas Jiva is the same as Brahma, the second.
No, jiva.
Jivo Brahmaiva.
Okay. Okay.
That was my
There's
part.
something wrong with that microphone. Okay. So the second part of Shankara's statement is Jivo Brahmaiva na param. Jiva in essence is nothing but Brahman. In fact, you could say, Shankara didn't say it, but you could say Jagat is Brahmaiva. Same. So it's like if you have one pot or 1,000 pots, they're all clay. If you have one jiva or an entire universe of jivas, it's all one Brahman. It's no difference. It's just the same two perspectives. A perspective of absolute reality, level of clay, and a perspective of relative reality, the reality of the form pot. Does that work for you? Okay. All right. I thought Narayanan looked familiar here in our list of questions. All right. Next question. Doubt. This is interesting. This comes from Manju, who lives in Bengal. And her question is with regard to some of Shankara's commentaries, especially some of his commentaries on Brahma Sutras and this big text, Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. She notices some statements that are highly suspect, difficult statements, where Shankara says, in his commentary on Brihadaranyaka, and she gives the passage, and where Shankara says that women should only do housework and they should not be allowed to study the Vedas. He says this. I don't deny it. And then she goes on to a more troubling expression in his commentaries on the Brahma Sutras, where he talks about shudras not being entitled to study the Vedas. And she goes on to say that those statements are actually contrary to most of Shankara's teachings, when he goes on talking about how there is only one consciousness, and these are all names and forms, and isn't this contradictory? Absolutely contradictory. Whenever you look at a passage of commentary, you have to look at it in the context of the commentary. So, in other words, when Shankara is talking about women in this Brihadaranyaka passage, or when he's talking about shudras, the low caste, in the Brahma Sutra commentary, there's a reason, a very specific reason he's talking about that. There's a context. And definitely when we take these statements, as she did, out of context, they look terrible. If you put them in context, they're still not great. So, and the reason for these statements at all is Shankara lived in India 800 years ago. How different was India? How different was India 80 years ago? 20 years ago, right? That the country, every country undergoes so much change. So Shankara's statements, which I don't accept them as being valid and meaningful today, but they were valid and meaningful 800 years ago. So he spoke according to his society. In his society, these statements made sense. At his time and place, these statements made sense, especially when you consider who Shankara was and the nature of the students he was addressing. So when you get the whole context, these statements are understandable. I didn't say correct. I said understandable. So anyway, I think the larger issue here has to do with when we extract statements out of context, then we lose so much. And a favorite example of that is, let me just escape my mind. Hold on. Ekam sat vipra bahudha varanti. This is a little snippet, comes from Rig Veda, and people love to quote it out of context. And let me show you why context is so important. Most of you have heard this. Ekam sat. Truth is one. Vipraha, the wise ones, bahudha, in many ways, varanti, spoke about that one truth. The problem with that interpretation is that is one small part of a whole hymn. Wouldn't it be interesting to look at what precedes that line and what follows that line? What precedes that line is he's talking about praising Indra, Vishnu, Surya, Agni. And that continues afterwards, talking about all these various deities. The context in the hymn is worship of all these different deities. Knowing that the context in the hymn is worship of all these deities, go back to that statement now. Ekam sat. Not truth is one. God is one. And vipraha, wise people, bahudha, in many ways, varanti, they describe that one God in many ways. That makes so much sense. But notice when you take it out of context, instead of saying there is one God that Hindus worship in many ways, which is according to the context, there is one truth. And the wise describe that one truth in many ways, and that's why there are so many different spiritual paths. Except that's not what the Veda says. Sounds good. And that's perhaps why that misinterpretation stuck, and that is, it sounds good, that there is one truth and you can follow one of many paths to reach that truth. Nothing wrong with that, except that's not what the Veda says. Okay, enough said. Let's take another question here. If this is from Vikas, I don't know where he lives. Vikas has several questions. One question is, if the observer is me, and observer means sakshi, means consciousness. If I am that consciousness, and that consciousness is part of a super consciousness. Consciousness is part of a super consciousness. Does that term super consciousness, first of all, it's English, so you wouldn't expect to find an English expression in a scripture, but you won't find the term super consciousness in Sanskrit either. This is a common modern approach. Yeah, there's much of what is taught in the name of Advaita Vedanta is very loosely connected to the traditional teachings. And for that reason, a lot of errors, small and big, comes in. I could consider this a fairly small error. The error is really not so much the term super consciousness. The error is when he said part. Consciousness, your consciousness is not a part. Jivatma, and now we'll use the proper Sanskrit terms. Jivatma, your consciousness, is not a part of Paramatma, the so-called supreme or super consciousness. There is no part and whole relationship. Paramatma is the absolute reality. It has parts. How many parts? What color are they? What shape are they? We're talking about reality here. We're not talking about things that have parts and dimensions. So what is counterintuitive is that you think your consciousness is yours and is therefore separate or independent of that Paramatma, that all-pervasive consciousness, and that's simply wrong. Your consciousness is identical to Paramatma. I'll say that again. The consciousness present in your experience right now is Paramatma. And if you ask, how can that be so? That's the right question. That's our starting point in Advaita Vedanta, to find out what is going on here, really. The brief, we won't get into it too much further, briefly put, one consciousness is reflected or manifest in countless minds. It's your mind that gives you the sense of individuality, not consciousness. So we've joked about this, I think, in our Vedanta class, to say my consciousness is completely incorrect. You don't possess your own independent consciousness. There is but one consciousness. Then what is the problem? The problem is failure to understand this correctly. The problem is focused on when you take yourself as being an individual conscious being, separate and independent of Paramatma, this error in thinking or confusion is the root problem that we address here in Advaita Vedanta. Okay, we'll take... There's one question here. I want to apologize for Daniel. Daniel lives in Philippines. And Daniel has a wonderful question here, but it goes on for about 4 pages. So my request is for questions to be a little bit more brief. Here's a question from... Okay, let's take parts of it. This is again, we got 5 different questions here from Sajit, who lives in Pune, near Mumbai. And again, better to be brief. Prarabdha karma is Sajit is asking about. And prarabdha karma, technically speaking, are those karmas because of which this birth has taken place. And those prarabdha karmas are finite in quantity, which is why we live a finite life. And when those karmas are exhausted, we die a natural death. So when prarabdha karma is over, a species dies, a person dies. I'm not sure why he used the word species. And if that's the case, when someone is enlightened, why is he not freed from the fructification of prarabdha karma? It needs to be explained a little bit. So we say again and again that one who is enlightened is not subject to rebirth, you understand that, but also breaks the so-called bonds of karma even in this life. And these kinds of expressions are used in the scriptures, but then we come to this technical discussion about an enlightened person was born with prarabdha karmas, When prarabdha karmas are exhausted, you die. When a person gets enlightened, are those prarabdha karmas exhausted? And there's actually a huge problem with that. Most of you can figure out, and that is if enlightenment involves the destruction or removal of your prarabdha karma, then as soon as you get enlightened, gone, khatam ho gaya. And I have this really silly image in my mind of some great guru with a whole group of students here, and one by one they start falling over. Of course, if that's the case, then how is a guru teaching? Right? So anyway, we're just playing with this. Obviously, it's a misnomer. Prarabdha karmas continue. What does it mean that an enlightened person is free from karma? That's really the issue here. Enlightened person is free from karma, including prarabdha karmas. How? If the prarabdha karmas are present and will keep the body living for a while longer after enlightenment, then how can you say the enlightened person is free from karma? Well, ask an enlightened person, and what they will tell you is prarabdha karma affects the body, prarabdha karma doesn't affect me. It's that simple. The enlightened person is one who knows himself or herself as pure consciousness. Pure consciousness is not affected by karma. Okay, why don't we take a couple of questions here in our hall. Who has a question? Raise your hand and get the microphone. Hopefully the microphone will work better. We'll see. That's not working well at all. Okay, I think I'll repeat your question for the sake of the online students.
Little complicated question, but I'll try to formulate. So, the Srimad Bhagavatam says that at least the version I read, that the aim of the work, aim of the karma cannot be the kind of rejection of the work. So
Projection of the work means what?
I mean that Bhagavatam, as I understood it, kind of rejects the moksha and says that the higher goal is the selfless service to the Lord, to God. So, and also scriptures describe like 5 types of moksha, right? And 4 of them is not
Okay.
is not sayujya mukti. Like they are more oriented on the kind of personal relationship with
Correct.
God.
Mm-hmm.
And also, if
And your question is?
Yeah, my question is, why is this like such a big difference in the types of the approaches? For example, Bhakti take the more like personal relationship.
Okay. So that's a nice question. And just to summarize the question, studying in the Bhagavata Purana, you'll find many teachings of a dualistic nature, which emphasize not spiritual wisdom, as we do here in Advaita Vedanta, but they worship developing a personal relationship with Ishvara, and in this case with Lord Vishnu, in any of Vishnu's forms. And that is taught throughout the Bhagavata Purana. And then the question is why is this, correct me if I'm wrong, why is this teaching so different from Advaita Vedanta? Is that the essence of your question? Okay. And this is one of the unique features of the Hindu tradition, and that is, I should say, Hindu traditions. What we call Hinduism, or what we can call Sanatana Dharma, or even better, call it Vaidika Dharma, is the most accurate expression. The Dharma, meaning religion, which is Vaidika, based on the Vedas. This is the most accurate term for it. And what we call, today we call it Hinduism. By the way, there are some people who get upset about the word Hinduism because it's not a Sanskrit word. Well, it's kind of loosely derived. Some of you anyway, will know the story that that when the invaders came through the Khyber Pass, they had to cross the river Sindhu in order to come into South Asia. And so the people on the other side of the river, and I'm told that they couldn't pronounce the letter S. I don't know if that's true or not. So Sindhu came out Hindu. That's what is commonly said. But my point here is that some people have become allergic to the word Hindu because it's not the traditional name. And I can understand their point, but it seems unnecessary to be allergic to it's just a commonly used word. No need to be allergic to it, but we can be more exact and refer to Vaidika Dharma, the religion based on the Vedas. What is unique about Vaidika Dharma is how different its approach is to every aspect of spiritual life. Most religions have one basic set of beliefs, one group of basic practices, and one understanding of the goal of life. That's Christianity, Judaism, Islam, all fall into that category. And to me, those approaches are one size fits all. Obviously, didn't fit me because when I was quite young, I came out of that. It didn't work for me. And what is unique about the teachings based on the Vedas is they're many and varied and different. They're made to address different groups of people. So the Vedas acknowledge the fact that everyone is not the same. And the Vedas then give different teachings for different groups of people. The most obvious example of that is how the main portion of the Veda is called Karma Kanda. This section of the Vedas dealing with karma. Karma here means rituals. So you have most of the Vedas dealing with rituals, and then you have something called Upasana Kanda, dealing with meditations, and something called Jnana Kanda, dealing with spiritual wisdom. It's interesting and significant that Karma Kanda is big, Upasana Kanda and Jnana Kanda are very small, because that reflects the nature of people. Most people want to do karma to get results. And that would include then Vedic rituals, which were done to get certain results. And that is the larger number of people. So therefore, the larger portion of the Vedas is dedicated for the sake of those people. Fewer people are attracted to meditation. Fewer people are attracted to spiritual wisdom. Therefore, those sections of the Vedas are smaller, because it represents the smaller numbers of people who are drawn to those sections. So this, I find, is absolutely unique if you compare the Vedic tradition to other religions. That's now you can see why I use that expression, one size fits all. So that really shows the distinction of this Hindu tradition, which to me is like an umbrella. And what is under the umbrella of Hinduism is anything that comes from the Vedas. So the Bhagavatam, the teachings of the Bhagavatam have evolved from this Vedic tradition, so they fall under that umbrella. An interesting counterexample is Buddhism. What Buddha taught is more or less consistent with everything under that umbrella of Hinduism. But Buddha rejected the authority of the Vedas. So even though what he taught was more or less consistent, he rejected the authority of the Vedas, and that places Buddhism outside of that umbrella. Even though what Buddhism teaches is not so different. Same applies for Jainism. Any follow-up on that?
Yes, I still did not got the answer. I mean, the final goal. Maybe it's hard to formulate the question. It's hard for me to imagine what is the state of the person who got enlightened and he left the body and mind and everything, and who learns to appreciate this state.
Okay. In fact, I think one of the online questions is exactly that. When you become enlightened and you die, body dies, consciousness doesn't die, body dies. So the question, interesting question, then who is left to enjoy enlightenment? That's a good question. And I think we'll see if we come to it later here in the emails. Excellent question. Enjoy enlightenment. How's this? An enlightened person is one who is fully identified with being Satchidananda Atma, pure consciousness, utterly untouched by any kind of suffering, untouched by the suffering caused by body, untouched by suffering caused by mind, untouched by suffering caused by your boss or mother-in-law or whoever. So absolutely untouched by suffering. Further, that consciousness is vast, boundaryless, limitless, full and complete. How can you improve on that? Now, that consciousness is present right now while you have a body. But if you're not enlightened, you will identify with the body and mind and then become subject to all this suffering. But an enlightened person is not identified with body and mind. An enlightened person knows himself or herself to be that pure, vast, untainted consciousness. That's true while the body lives, and that's equally true after the body falls. Now, a little technical distinction here, and that is when we use the word experience. What will you experience after you die? And the answer, whether you're enlightened or not, if you don't have a body and mind, you experience nothing. Without a mind, you can experience nothing. So if you're unenlightened and you die, whether or not you get born again, if you are not yet reborn, let's suppose, you experience nothing at all because you need a mind to experience anything. And the same is equally true for the enlightened person. So, which also demonstrates that the goal is not an experience. Experiences come and go. The essence of who you are is already vast, full, and complete, so nothing more is needed. Okay, let's take a couple more questions here. This is a question from Nita, who asks, when perfect peace and contentment are required to gain enlightenment, why does viparita bhavana still remain after enlightenment and require nididhyasana? We have to parse this a little bit. And also, many times when we compose questions, our thinking isn't clear, so the question contains a problem. This question contains a problem. When perfect peace and contentment is required to gain enlightenment, can you see the problem? Cart and horse are flipped around. So enlightenment results in perfect peace and contentment. Then, that being so, why does viparita bhavana? Viparita bhavana is, in fact, in our Vedanta class, we talked about deha vasana as an example. Lingering identification with the body and mind. Viparita bhavana is a technical expression, but what it means is lingering identification with the body and mind. Here's what she is asking, why is nididhyasana needed for after enlightenment? First of all, whether it's needed or not depends on the person. If they have no lingering identification with the body and mind, then nothing else is needed. You get enlightened, you're done. But that's usually not the way it works because our minds are so habitual, so highly conditioned. And just to make it very, very straightforward, imagine that you have, well, you don't have to imagine, you have lived fully identified with the physical body and mind for how long? Decades and decades. And for some of us, more decades. Tell me, that identification would grow extremely strong over that period of time. In fact, modern neuroscience really demonstrates this, that anything that's repeated in your mind gets burned into the brain. This is modern neuroscience. Your thinking affects your brain. Obviously, your brain affects your thinking. But the fact is that we create, in Sanskrit, we call samskara. We create these samskaras, these mental grooves, mental impressions, simply put, habitual thinking. So the moment you get enlightened, well, all those mental grooves burnt into the synapses of your physical brain, will they all suddenly change? Is that reasonable? So again, this habitual identification with the body is programmed in your brain, not just your mind. So after enlightenment, it's unreasonable to expect a physiological change of your brain to take place instantaneously. Therefore, the practice of nididhyasana is prescribed to speed up that process of your brain catching up with your mind, so to speak, which is to say, you have discovered your true nature as utterly independent of your body and mind, but these habitual identifications remain. That habitual identification is what's removed through the process of nididhyasana. This is let's see. Okay. This is a question from Robert, who lives in Denver. Robert asks, there are two entities, Atma, and number two, the mind-body, together, which is fine. Those who are enlightened identify with Atma, correct? Those who are unenlightened identify with body, mind, mostly correct. My question is, who is the entity making the identification? And we just had a long discussion in the Vedanta class that preceded this satsang, and that is, in your mind is a sense of self, self-identity. And the way I described it in the Vedanta class, let me share it with all the satsangis. The way I described it is, suppose you were to write an autobiography. Would that autobiography just be a couple of pages long? Your life is complicated. So suppose you have this 400-page autobiography that describes who you are. That 400-page autobiography, you don't have to write it. It's already in your mind. It's your self-identity. And that self-identity is a feature of your mind, your self-definition. And that, we call it ahankara, or ego, not in the sense of pride, but in the sense of that self-concept. And so the one who makes the identification, it's not one. Identification takes place in the mind. If you say, how does that happen? And the answer to that is naturally, like anything else, because you're born ignorant, you're born not recognizing your true nature as Satchidananda Atma, so therefore naturally you will identify with the body and mind. Okay, I'll take one more question. How are we doing on time? Okay, take one more question here. This is a question from Subi. I presume that's the nickname for Subramaniam. Nice South Indian names. Subi becomes Subu also, right? Subu, Subi. Why? Subramaniam. With a group of children, I said, I used to teach a lot of Hindu children, and they would complain that their teachers at school couldn't pronounce their names. And I said, give them a break. If your name is Venkata Bala Subramaniam, what do you expect your teacher to do? And of course, it's not equally a problem. It is somewhat a problem in India. That's why Subramaniam becomes Subi or Subu. Okay. Anyway, this Subi lives in Chicago, and he asks that people get angry for all kinds of reasons. How to deal with such people, and how to advise them on how to control their anger in a dharmic way. And this is a little tricky. So you see someone behaving adharmically. Maybe, how about, let's create a scenario. You're at a store, and somebody is shouting at the clerk behind the cash register. And you're standing there watching the scene unfold. And definitely this person is verbally abusing the employee of the store, and your inclination is to stop him, which would be a good thing to do because abuse is going on. So you say, stop it. So for you to intervene in some way, by the way, it may or may not work. Occasionally it can make a situation worse. So you have to use your own judgment and intervene if you think it's helpful. But the issue here is, how to advise them on how to control anger. Is that your job? Who appointed you to control other people? Now, please understand, to stand up and protect someone from harm, excellent. But to try to change someone else's behavior is futile. You know, something obvious that we will consider just for a moment, and that is, think about some traits that you have that you try to change. Some bad habits or just things about yourself that you wish could be different, and you try to change. How successful have you been in changing those habits and traits? Not so successful most of the time. Now, here's the obvious question. If you're not very successful in changing your own behaviors, how would you imagine being successful in changing someone else's behavior? It's wishful thinking. So, anyway, so how to deal with an angry person? Intervene if it's appropriate, and if it's not appropriate, walk away. Yeah, certainly not to argue with an angry person. Okay, shall we take another question here? Anyone with a question? Microphone, please. Actually, no microphone. That's not it's not working very well. Okay, please, your question.
It was mentioned twice in the class that moksha is not the result of action. Rather, the way I understand it, it's the result of knowledge and discovering and identifying with that true self, Atma. I'm finding it hard to bridge the gap with attaining knowledge, because if I take no action, how do I attain knowledge, right? So if you could help me bridge that gap.
Okay. Very good question. We understand, according to the teachings of Advaita Vedanta, moksha is not the result of what you do. The question, which is a very good question, is if I do nothing, will I get moksha? I'm paraphrasing your question. And obviously the answer to that is no. So actions that contribute to gaining spiritual wisdom are really important. But when we say that actions don't make you enlightened, that doesn't mean you shouldn't do anything. That's not the message at all. It means that actions which contribute to your spiritual growth, you should definitely engage in, but look at the flip side. Actions that don't contribute to your spiritual growth should be rejected. So there is a significant change in lifestyle and how you approach your daily activities to focus your activities and focus your attention on things that will lead to spiritual growth. The distinction that Shankara is making in the text we're studying is the technical one, and that is action alone cannot result in enlightenment. It's a technical point. By the way, there's just to make that point very clear, there's a lot of logic, a lot of reasoning behind that statement. Why, if I just say, action can never lead to moksha, enlightenment, that sounds very dogmatic. Shankaracharya himself says, jnanam eva mokshaha. Eva means only. The only way to gain enlightenment is through jnanam, and you correctly said, through the jnanam is not here information or knowing what Vedanta teaches. Jnanam here means the discovery of your true nature as Satchidananda Atma. Okay, but that does sound very dogmatic. Sounds like, only knowledge alone cannot, knowledge alone can make you enlightened. No amount of action can make you enlightened. And here's the reasoning behind that, and the reason it's not dogma, but it is a reasoned truth, that action cannot lead to moksha. Action cannot produce moksha. Moksha we understand as an extraordinary goal. And there's some very simple logic here. For a small goal, you require a small effort. For a bigger goal, you require more effort. How about for an effort, how about for a goal which is understood as the ultimate goal of life? How much effort would theoretically be required if it's a so-called off-the-chart goal? Then it'll be an off-the-chart effort, infinite effort, which is not humanly possible. So that's the logic behind this statement. Do you have any follow-up? Okay. Let's take just one or two more questions from online, and then I think it'll be good to wrap up. Let's see this one. And by the way, I can't take every single question, both from our local audience and from online. So if I skip your question, I'm sorry. I just will do what we can here. Let's see here. Actually, I think we've done pretty good. Here, we'll take this is Ajit. Ask a question. So, Ajit lives in Naples, Florida, and he is referring to I'm not sure where, but at some point I've said I have a pet peeve, and the pet peeve is when people say or write aum, A-U-M, instead of om. So the word is om for 1,000 reasons, and this AUM stuff is quite spurious, and there's a lot of reasons it's emerged, but it is absolutely contrary to the tradition. So I've called it my pet peeve, because many people like to write AUM, which in Sanskrit is absolutely incorrect. I don't want to give you a Sanskrit lesson, but let me just say that AUM is incorrect, not only scripturally incorrect, it's incorrect in Sanskrit language. And Om is a Sanskrit word, so what to say? Anyway, so the question is that Ajit asks, you have a pet peeve. Can enlightened people have pet peeves? This is an interesting question. So, we say that enlightened persons do not have raga and dvesha. Raga is a compulsion to get what you want. Dvesha is a compulsion to run away from what you don't want. Many people use the word desire, but desire is such a loose word. It's better that we're more precise. Yes, the enlightened person is free from desire. In what way? Is free from raga and dvesha, compulsion. Compulsion to get what you want, compulsion to avoid what you don't want. So I say AUM is a pet peeve, but is there any compulsion associated with? If you say Aum, am I gonna? I may shake my head, but I'm certainly not going to strike you. And we'll make some, I think we'll conclude the satsang with just a couple comments about an enlightened person. An enlightened person is not someone who is like a blank page. People, sometimes we get these really odd notions of what it is to be enlightened. I've given many times the example of my guru who liked coffee. He was raised in South India, and coffee is the main drink in the South. So if you ask him, do you want coffee or tea? He would say, I want coffee. Want? You see my point? This Swami has a want? Has a desire? Here's what happens. If you say, I'm sorry, Swamiji, we don't have any coffee. Would you like some tea? Sure, why not? That's the point. There's no compulsion in it. He himself used the word binding desire to distinguish it from non-binding desires. An enlightened person is free from binding desires. Define binding desire in this way: a desire whose non-fulfillment causes suffering. Is it possible to have a desire whose non-fulfillment doesn't cause suffering? Sure. Like in the coffee example. So you can have all kinds of desires. Can you imagine an enlightened person goes to one of our New Jersey diners, famous, and he is sitting there, we'll make it nice, at the counter. And the waitress comes over and says, what would you want? The enlightened person says, I'm enlightened, I don't want anything. I'm just playing with this just to make the point. And I'll close with my guru's observation. He said, an enlightened person is a normal person. He added a part. He said, the only normal person. That means a person minus all the problems, a person minus suffering. So anyway, we want to understand that enlightened people still have, we'll call them preferences instead of desires. No problem. Okay, good place to conclude our satsang. If you have further questions, you can send them by email for our local students. We'll meet again next Sunday, and we'll continue with this. Thank you for coming, and we'll end with our prayer. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinaha Sarve Santu Niramayaha Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschad Dukkha Bhag Bhavet Asato Ma Sadgamaya Kamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritangamaya. Om Shanti 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 Om. Tat Sat. Very nice.